This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. Today, we are continuing our series on continuity and change in the Old Testament, here, number 13, believe it or not, on exile, specifically the book of Ezekiel. Very underread book in the Old Testament, partly because it's a little wild, but it's a very important book because of some of the developments of new things in it. Because, of course, it's facing a situation they'd never faced. After the people are headed off into exile, the nation has collapsed. And Babylon hauls off the people living there in exile. But it's more complicated than that, because we usually give you the date of 586 BCE as the date when the temple was destroyed and everyone's taken off. But it actually happened in stages. And most notably, 10 years earlier, in 596, about 10,000 people were taken off, and it was noted to be all of the leaders were taken off into exile. Well, what's happened? Ezekiel is one of these people who's taken off into exile, and so he and this group are now living in Babylon, and they need to learn, how do we follow God in a foreign country as an enslaved people? Well, there's a lot of different things that are going on. One of the themes that we have been looking at, probably for the last 5 videos or so, is the idea that Torah has consequences. Meaning Torah, meaning the Sinai covenant. If you follow the Torah, then consequences will be good. If you do not follow the Torah, the consequences will be punishment and will be suffering that look like regular things in this life. We've seen that again and again. Part of what the argument in the Deuteronomistic historian was the reason that the people did go, in fact, off into exile was because they were no longer following this Torah, and there were natural consequences to that. Well, we now have a new development. The Torah, by the way, handily, doesn't have much to do with the temple, and they could follow it off in exile, and so it really takes primary place. But there becomes a challenge, because it really brings up a new tension about the collective and the individual. Before this time, religiosity was always collective. We all follow Torah, or we all fail to follow Torah. There would be individuals who would always remain faithful, even if the nation was not, but they all were either blessed or punished, depending upon the fidelity to this Torah covenant. Well, now there becomes a problem. What happens when there's a major group who lives somewhere else and who acts differently than everyone else? Now, we already had a division between the northern and southern kingdoms we talked about last time, but that was relatively easy. That you use the same principle, the nation was just a little different. One had 2 tribes, one had 10. Now, though, we have people living in exile who very much identify as Israelites, not some other nation. They are Israelites, they just happen to be off in exile. And yet, they're not behaving the same way as the people still in the nation. And so what do you do? Because what ends up happening is Ezekiel leads to reform in exile, and people start to really follow Torah. And so their consequences for that should be blessings. However, the people still in the land with the temple, Ezekiel says, are doing terrible things. They are not following Torah at all. They're desecrating the temple, and it gets a little wild. He goes on a vision, kind of a journey where he's picked up into the sky and he lands back in Israel and he gets to see what's going on, and it's absolutely awful. So should the people who are off in exile, this group, should they be punished the same way, even though they're following Torah? And so Ezekiel comes up with a new tension. Something we've never seen before. Individual accountability. Meaning, if you are following Torah, you will receive blessings. If you are not, you will not. But more than anything, collectively, others who are not following Torah won't affect you. That's something we've never had before. Is notorious in the book of Joshua when they conquer an area and there's practices they're supposed to follow. One person doesn't, and the whole assembly is punished. But here, now, if one person wouldn't, well, that one person would be the one who had the consequences. Wildly new idea, but it was a practical necessity because they're not all together. They're not all one people. How could the people off in exile in Babylon have any influence at all at what the people in Israel were doing? So it becomes individual. However, it doesn't become so individual, some radical individuality, that it would have something like what people like to say today, like, what's your personal relationship with God? Well, they didn't believe in that in the same way. They didn't even have the idea of personal the way we do. And so, where does Ezekiel tie this together? Well, he remains collective in the hope. And hope starts to be a major focus, and that the hope that is coming is eschatological. Eschaton is the Greek word for end, meaning a study of something is going to happen at the end. There is going to be a day of the Lord upon which God is going to come back and God is going to set right that which was wrong. And that's going to be for everybody. And in it, it's a new kind of hope. We're going to have a new temple because the one that is there has been desecrated to the point it is no longer useful. Ezekiel suggests God has officially left the area. And then there'll be a new temple God's going to return to. In many ways, there'll be a new Torah. The Torah itself is not going to change, but how it's followed. It's going to say that it's going to enter the heart of all people, so much so that no one will actually have to be taught Torah. They will simply naturally do it. Torah will be perfectly followed. And so here we have a new Torah, and frankly, they're a new people. And the book of Ezekiel recognizes this as something totally different. For those of you who study the New Testament, this is one of the first true eschatological, or in New Testament we call it apocalyptic. Apocalypse is something's going to be revealed. Moments in the Old Testament where it shows there is something radically new coming. Now, there's going to be others with that same sort of idea that God's going to come back and things will be radically different. You see it everywhere in the book of Isaiah. You see it in Micah. You see it in Joel. And some connection with Joel that the Spirit is going to come and enter into people's heart. And that's why the Torah is going to be perfectly followed. And that's here in Ezekiel as well. But it's something new. The focus now becomes about a new kind of hope for a new kind of day. Very different than, are you following Torah or not? And if you're not following Torah, change your behavior. Yes, there is focus on individual accountability, but really the religiosity starts to become far more one of hope than it does one of corrective ethics. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.